Medieval warfare was never just about who could swing a sword the hardest. It was about adapting, surviving, and outsmarting the enemy in the harshest, bloodiest environments imaginable. Soldiers, knights, and even common peasants had to rely on more than brute strength. They had to get creative. And that creativity led to the invention of weapons that were both horrifyingly effective and unexpectedly ingenious. These were tools made not only to kill, but to dominate, to terrify, and to solve specific problems on the battlefield. They might not have been elegant, but they got the job done, and often changed the course of battles because of it. Number 1. The Morning Star. The Morning Star wasn't just a medieval weapon, it was an absolute statement. One glance at it and you knew it wasn't made for clean, honorable combat. This was a tool of devastation, built not only to kill, but to crush, mangle, and terrify. Unlike a sleek sword or a precise dagger, the Morning Star didn't pretend to be elegant. It was designed to overwhelm through brute force, and it excelled at that job, in ways that made it both feared and respected on the battlefield. The typical Morning Star consisted of a solid wooden or metal shaft, often reinforced with metal bands and a large, heavy spiked head. That head could be a solid ball or even a multi-faced steel orb, and each spike served a deadly purpose. The idea wasn't just to pierce flesh, but to puncture through armor, tear open chainmail, and cave in helmets. In a time when the arms race between weapons and armor was constantly shifting, the Morning Star was a ruthless countermeasure. Soldiers in full plate might have been protected from blades, but not from a solid blow with steel spikes backed by momentum and muscle. It's easy to assume this weapon was clumsy or heavy to the point of being unwieldy, but that's not accurate. The balance of a well-crafted Morning Star allowed it to be swung with surprising speed, especially in the hands of someone strong and determined. And because it didn't require the finesse of swordsmanship or the precision of archery, it became a go-to for a wide range of fighters, from knights during brutal cavalry charges to foot soldiers defending a choke point in a siege. This wasn't a nobleman's weapon polished for duels. It was a war instrument built to shatter whatever stood in its way. One of the clever aspects of the Morning Star's design lies in the spike layout. The spikes weren't randomly placed, they were spaced to maximize surface contact and concentrate energy into sharp points. When the weapon struck, it didn't just hit, it bit. The force of the swing was channeled into these spikes, which could dig into armor gaps or drive through the thinner metal of visors, shoulder joints, and even breastplates under the right conditions. Unlike a sword that might slide off angled armor, the Morning Star stuck, crushed, and often left the target incapable of fighting back. There were also variations. Some versions featured multiple flanges, flat-ridged edges around the ball, which could combine blunt force with tearing impact. Others incorporated longer shafts for mounted combat, letting riders deliver devastating vertical blows from above. And then there was the infamous flail variant, which turned the weapon into something almost unmanageable but highly dangerous. Instead of a fixed head, it had a spiked ball connected by a chain, allowing the user to whip it in wide, unpredictable arcs. While harder to control, it could swing over shields, around corners, and crash into spots other weapons simply couldn't reach. The psychological impact of the Morning Star also shouldn't be underestimated. Imagine being a lightly armored soldier and seeing someone charging at you with a spiked iron ball, ready to crush bones and shatter skulls. There's no clean wound, no surgical cut, just blunt trauma and raw destruction. It wasn't just a way to win a fight. It was a way to dominate it, to instill fear before a single blow was even thrown. Number 2, the War Scythe. At first glance, the War Scythe doesn't scream a weapon of war. It doesn't shine like a knight's sword, doesn't look menacing like a spiked mace, and wasn't forged in royal armories. It started in the dirt, in the fields, in the hands of peasants who spent their lives cutting crops, not enemies. But when chaos erupted, when revolts sparked or armies marched through quiet villages, those same peasants turned their farming tools into something far more dangerous. The scythe, once used to harvest grain, became an improvised but shockingly deadly weapon of resistance and rebellion. Originally, the scythe blade curved outward from the side of a long wooden shaft, perfect for slicing low across rows of wheat. But in war, that orientation was awkward and inefficient for combat. So those who repurposed it flipped the blade forward, aligning it more like a spear or halberd. With that simple change, rotating the blade 90 degrees, the tool transformed. Now it was a long-reaching, slashing weapon that could be used in vertical or diagonal attacks with devastating results. The curve gave it a unique hooking action that wasn't just effective, it was unpredictable. Shields, armor, even mounted fighters could be outmaneuvered by the War Scythe's reach and shape. The brilliance of this weapon wasn't in sophisticated craftsmanship or advanced metallurgy, it was in its raw practicality. In many regions, especially during peasant uprisings, ordinary people didn't have access to military-grade gear. But they had tools, they had scythes, and they had a reason to fight. What makes the War Scythe stand out in medieval history is how a symbol of labor was turned into an instrument of lethal defiance. The long shaft allowed fighters to stand behind the front line and still strike enemies, which was crucial in group formations. You didn't need to be face-to-face with your target. You could attack from behind a row of spears using wide arcing slashes that targeted necks, legs, and arms. Its curved blade wasn't just for slicing either, it could trap. When swung properly, it could hook behind a shield, catch a leg, or even wrap around a weapon, giving the wielder a chance to pull or off-balance their opponent. If a soldier was on horseback, one well-placed swing could catch the saddle or stirrup and yank them down. In group combat, that kind of disruption caused chaos. One soldier falling could open up a line. One hook that pulled away a shield could make room for a fatal strike. And while the War Scythe lacked the refinement of traditional polearms like glaives or halberds, it had an unmistakable presence. It looked savage, improvised, and unpolished, but that's what made it terrifying. It said, "I wasn't made to fight, but I will." It became a symbol of desperation turned into strength, a silent message that even the unarmed could become deadly when pushed far enough. You didn't need nobility or a coat of arms to be dangerous. You just needed purpose and a sharpened blade. Number 3, the Mancatcher. Unlike the brutal killing tools of medieval warfare that shattered bones or pierced through armor, the Mancatcher played an entirely different role, one built on dominance, restraint, and public humiliation. It wasn't designed to kill, at least not directly. Its entire purpose was to capture, control, and completely disarm a target without shedding blood. This strange but ingenious weapon was a long metal or wooden pole with a spring-loaded or spiked circular trap at the end. Imagine a forked collar or an open jaw made of steel. When thrust toward an opponent, it could wrap around their neck, arms, or torso, and lock them in place with terrifying precision. What made the Mancatcher so unique wasn't just its design, but the intention behind its use. While knights and soldiers clashed with swords, axes, and warhammers to gain ground or eliminate threats, the Mancatcher operated under an entirely different logic: leverage. In the high-stakes game of medieval politics and warfare, the capture of a nobleman or ranking officer could be more profitable than 100 ordinary kills. Killing a knight ended the threat. Capturing him could finance a campaign. If the prisoner was a wealthy noble, their family, or even their kingdom, would often pay enormous sums to get them back alive. Ransom, after all, was big business. Imagine the moment it was used in combat. A noble clad in full, shining armor galloping through the battlefield, confident and seemingly untouchable. Then in one swift move, a foot soldier or castle guard lunges forward with the Mancatcher, wrapping its pronged collar around the knight's upper body or helmet. With a brutal yank, the rider is torn from the saddle and slammed to the ground, not by a sword, but by a long pole and sheer mechanical advantage. The spikes lining the inside of the collar ensured that struggling only led to pain. Some versions use spring-loaded mechanisms to clamp down even harder, making escape nearly impossible without outside help. But this wasn't just a tool of war. It found use in law enforcement and castle defense as well. Guards could use it to subdue unruly prisoners, pull intruders through narrow gates, or restrain individuals during riots or political unrest. In tight castle corridors or while standing atop parapets, the Mancatcher allowed defenders to remain out of arm's reach while still exerting full physical control over an aggressor. It was practical, safe for the user, and terrifyingly effective. There's also the psychological toll to consider. Being subdued in such a manner, especially in front of allies or troops, wasn't just painful, it was deeply humiliating. The sight of a decorated warrior being dragged off a horse or held helpless by a giant steel collar sent a powerful message to others. No matter how high your status or how polished your armor, you were still vulnerable. The Mancatcher turned pride into shame and battlefield authority into helplessness. It was medieval restraint, punishment, and power play all in one, and that made it one of the most strategic tools of its time. Number 4, the Beck de Corban. In the brutal chess game that was medieval warfare, the Beck de Corban stood out as a weapon designed not just to damage but to specifically neutralize the rising dominance of full-body armor. As the arms race of the Middle Ages escalated and knights marched into battle encased in increasingly sophisticated plate armor, the traditional weapons of war, swords, axes, even spears, began to struggle against the cold, hardened steel, protecting vital organs and limbs. The Beck de Corban, meaning raven's beak in French, emerged as a brilliant response to this challenge, not only in its appearance but in its lethality. At first glance, this polearm might appear oddly shaped, even unbalanced, but every part of it served a calculated purpose. On one side of the weapon sat a hammerhead, flat, dense, and made for crushing. It wasn't there to slice or pierce, but to cave in armor, to send blunt force trauma reverberating through a knight's breastplate, ribs, and bones beneath. On the reverse side curved the weapon's namesake, the beak. This spike, sharp and menacing, arched backward in a vicious hook. It wasn't a slashing tool, it was built to puncture, to wedge into the weak points of an armored body, targeting those narrow, flexible sections where protection faltered, the gaps behind knees, inside elbows, under armpits, between the plates at the groin, or just beneath the edge of a helmet. At the tip of the pole was yet another spike, straight and hardened, used for thrusting in downward strikes. This made the weapon terrifyingly versatile. The wielder could strike vertically with precision, hook backward with savage efficiency, or hammer forward to break a shield or ribcage. It was like carrying 3 weapons in one: a blunt instrument, a piercing claw, and a stabbing pike. And it wasn't meant for wild swings or flashy flourishes. The Beck de Corban rewarded control, aim, and timing. It was tactical violence. Every move had a purpose. Fighting against plate armor required more than brute strength. It demanded an understanding of anatomy, of armor design, of how to exploit movement and openings. Warriors trained with the Beck de Corban learned to be patient and accurate. Instead of trying to cleave through an opponent, they watched for the right angle, the right second, when a joint was exposed, and then they struck. Hard, fast, and with intent to disable. If the beak found its mark, it could wedge into the armor and remain stuck, often ripping it apart on the way back out. If the hammer connected, it could dent steel inward, turning the armor itself into a weapon against the person wearing it. In tight formations, the Beck de Corban was equally dangerous. It could be jabbed between shields in the crush of battle, hooked behind legs to trip an enemy, or swung over the heads of frontline fighters to bring down an opponent hiding behind cover. It worked in close quarters and open field skirmishes alike, making it a favored choice for both infantry and bodyguards tasked with facing well-armored foes. But beyond its functionality, there was a psychological edge. Watching a comrade crumple beneath a single focused strike or bleed out slowly after a spike tore through their side wasn't just physically demoralizing, it shattered the illusion of invincibility that knights so carefully built. Armor no longer meant safety. The Beck de Corban turned protection into a challenge, and against its deliberate, methodical strikes, even the most fortified warriors learned fear. Number 5, the boiling oil trap. There was perhaps no medieval defense more terrifyingly effective or psychologically scarring than the boiling oil trap. Unlike swords or arrows, which killed cleanly and quickly, this weapon didn't just stop enemies in their tracks. It broke them, it humiliated them, and it often left survivors disfigured, screaming, and permanently disabled. While commonly dramatized in stories and films, the reality behind this brutal tactic was far worse than any theatrical depiction could capture. In the grim and desperate context of a castle under siege, where defenders were often outnumbered and cornered, every advantage had to be exploited to its fullest. The walls might protect from battering rams and siege towers, but when attackers got too close, scaling ladders, gathering at gates, or clustering near weak points, defenders had to act fast and with maximum impact. That's where the boiling oil trap came into play, although in reality it was rarely actual oil. More often it was scalding water, molten animal fat, or even red-hot sand, materials that were readily available, easy to heat, and devastating when poured from above. Castles were ingeniously designed for this sort of defense. Hidden in the stonework were narrow vertical shafts called murder holes, often located above entrance gates or built into the ceilings of narrow corridors. From these openings, defenders could pour or drop heated substances directly onto the heads of invaders without ever revealing themselves to enemy archers or crossbowmen. These holes weren't placed randomly. They were strategically built where attackers were most likely to gather, places they couldn't avoid if they wanted to breach the stronghold. What made this trap so brutally effective wasn't just the heat, it was the way it invaded. Boiling liquid didn't need to puncture armor or cut skin to do damage. It seeped, it ran. It slipped into gaps between plates, underneath helmets, into boots, behind gloves. Chainmail offered little protection because the liquid could flow straight through the links and sit directly on the skin. Boiling fat was especially cruel because it didn't cool quickly. It stuck. It sizzled. It cooked human flesh like meat in a pan. And once it clung to skin or clothing, it kept burning, leaving behind horrifying injuries and unbearable pain. If the materials used weren't liquid, that didn't make them any less horrific. Heated sand, when dumped from above, slid inside armor and settled into crevices that couldn't be quickly reached or shaken out. It didn't pour, it embedded itself, tiny grains acting like a slow-motion fire inside your own protective shell. Victims couldn't pull off their gear fast enough. The pain was relentless, and the confusion it caused often led to panic among nearby troops. This wasn't just a physical attack, it was psychological warfare at its rawest. Imagine climbing a ladder toward a fortress only to hear the screams of your comrades who reached the top before you. Their flesh peeling, their armor searing into their skin, their attempts to retreat turning into a deadly fall back down onto the spears or rocks below. Witnessing that kind of suffering didn't just hurt morale, it shattered it. Siege armies had to think twice about rushing forward, knowing what waited above wasn't just steel, but scalding agony. Perhaps the most clever aspect of the boiling oil trap was its simplicity. It didn't require master blacksmiths or skilled warriors to operate. Any soldier, cook, or servant could carry a bucket, heat a cauldron, and pour. Fuel was abundant, and heat sources were already part of daily life in a castle. In times of siege, when every resource mattered, this low-cost, high-impact defense became not only a lifesaver for those inside, but a nightmare for those outside.